Hi everyone, today we're going to discuss about cell membranes, continue our examination of the cells in more and more detail. Why do we actually need a cell membrane or a plasma membrane? Well, cells need to have an inside and outside, because you have to separate the inside from the environment. If you don't have a cell membrane, you just have a bunch of stuff floating in water, which is not a cell. So that cell membrane acts as the boundary. The cell membrane is going to separate the inside from the outside. Sometimes we need certain things to get in through our cell membrane, such as food, like sugar, proteins, fats. We need oxygen to get in so our muscles so we actually can break down food. We need water to get in because water is kind of required for life. And we also need to have some things able to get out of the cell. We need waste to get out. We need salts, we need CO2, we need water sometimes to get out if we have too much water. And sometimes we need to get products out like hormones and other things and other proteins that are made in your cells. The key thing is we need cells that materials have to get in and products or waste have to get out. So then the cell membrane's job is to control this. How do you build a barrier that keeps the watery contents of the cell separate from the watery environment? The cytoplasm is mostly water. The environment is mostly water surrounding a cell. So how do you actually create that separation that's going to keep everything inside the cell that's watery and keep out other things that are watery that are not inside the cell? Well, thinking about it, what substance do you know that doesn't mix well with water? When we're talking about not mixing well with water, we should be thinking about hydrophobic, nonpolar, bringing that information back in your mind. And when we think about that, we think of fats or lipids. Remember, oil and water don't mix, so your cell membrane is actually going to be made of lipids because it's actually going to separate and keep the water inside the cell, and it's also going to keep the water outside the cell at the same time. If we zoom in on the cell membrane, we can see that the cell membrane looks like this down here. It has that double layer structure. The membrane is made up of a special kind of lipid. It's not just any olive oil or butter mixture. It's a special kind of lipid known as a phospholipid. Phospholipid. So the first part, phospho, and then we have a lipid. It's known as having a split personality. The top is known as a phosphate head, and then you have two fatty acid or lipid tails. So this entire thing is known as a phospholipid, a phosphate head and two lipid tails. The heads are charged, they're polar, so they're hydrophilic, they attract to water, while the tails, being lipid, are hydrophobic, nonpolar, so they are actually repelled by water. As I mentioned, the membrane is a double layer, and we can clearly see here in the double layer that the heads like water, so they're actually going to stick on the outside of the sandwich. And because the tails don't like water, the tails are going to form the inside of your sandwich and are going to form the interior of your cell membrane. Another way to describe the cell membrane is that it's a phospholipid bilayer. Once again, bi just means two. So it just means that your cell membrane is a sandwich of two pieces of phospholipid bread. It's important that membranes are fluid so that they can actually move around. You don't want your membrane being solid because then you don't have the ability to actually move around. So the membranes, or the phospholipids, can actually drift within the bilayer. It's not some kind of rigid structure. It's more, think of it as a sea of fat. Your cells are surrounded by a sea of fat that is just like, can have waves in it, just like the ocean can. So most of the lipids can drift laterally, so they can move just like the ocean back and forth like in waves. We call this the fluid mosaic model. The reason why it's fluid, as we said, the membrane can actually move, the phospholipids can move around. The reason why it's known as a mosaic is like a tile mosaic. You have a whole bunch of different tiles all put together. Well, we mentioned a while ago that the cell membrane is not just lipids. The cell membrane also has some protein floating in it. So that's why we call it a fluid mosaic model. Scientists, when they looked at it under a microscope, saw this sea of fat with these protein islands almost floating in it. So under their eyes, it looked like a tile mosaic. So the scientists decided to call it a fluid mosaic model. This idea that your cell membrane is a sea of fat with these protein islands drifting within it. Sorry, your cells are a sea of fat. You're mostly fat. There's one important membrane molecule that gets a bad rap, known as cholesterol. Cholesterol, we always say, is so terrible. You need low cholesterol. You need lower cholesterol. You're going to die if you have too much cholesterol, which is true. However, if you don't have cholesterol, you also can die. Think about if you go outside. When you go outside and it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit, if you're up north, you don't instantly freeze. You don't become a stick of butter. And when you go outside when it's 110 degrees out, you don't melt into a puddle of fat. All of this is due to cholesterol. So the job of cholesterol is actually keeps the membrane pretty much the same fluidity. So it's going to keep it the same consistency no matter the temperature. So at warm temperatures, it's actually going to stop the membrane from just falling apart and relaxing and just becoming a puddle. Because that would be bad if you just melted when you walked outside in Florida. And when it's cold outside, it's actually going to stop the fat molecules from getting too close and forming a stick of butter. So cholesterol gets a bad rap, but it's really important to make sure that your cell membrane stays consistently fluid so you don't have issues and you don't die. Here we can see the cell membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, and we can see the little cholesterol molecules nestled within the bilayer. So they're going to stop it from separating too much when it's warm, and they're going to stop it from compacting too tight when it's cold outside. The membrane is a collage of different proteins. We mentioned how it's a fluid mosaic model, so it's fat with proteins floating in it. There's 2 different types of proteins that I like you to know. Depending on where they're actually located, they have different names. Well, the first one is known as a peripheral protein. If something's on the peripheral, it means it's on the outside. Your peripheral vision is on the outside of where you're mainly looking. So peripheral proteins are not embedded, meaning that they're just on one side of the cell membrane. They don't actually go through the membrane. They're just on the top layer. The other one is known as an integral protein. They're integrated proteins. These guys actually penetrate the core and span the membrane. So peripherals are only found on the outside, while integral are integrated. So they're actually going to be fully placed within the membrane and are actually going to connect the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Usually integral proteins are great for communication. They're great for being channels to allow things into your cells, while peripherals are usually used for messaging. Here we can see a cell membrane. Usually when people draw a cell, we usually just draw a big circle and that's your cell. That's your cell membrane, just a circle. However, really, we should be drawing things on the outside of the cell, things sticking off your membrane, because it's not a smooth surface. You can see this is our membrane. We see our lipid bilayer, we see some cholesterol, we see some carbohydrates sticking off the chains. We see an integral protein here spanning the entire cell membrane. We see glycoproteins sticking out. We see, where's a peripheral protein? I don't see any on here. Actually, oh, here's one. Peripheral proteins. These guys that are only found on one side of the cell membrane. Here's another one more. Microfilaments on the inside. So it's a very complex structure. It's not just a smooth circle when you draw a cell. And that's the key factor I want you to understand. That it is a very complex structure. There are 6 major functions of membrane proteins. I don't expect you to memorize these, but these are just for understanding. You have transport, so the membrane proteins are going to allow things to get in and out of the cell. Some are enzymatic. I'm not going to go over that. Signal transduction, which means that it's actually going to pass signals on from either the nucleus or from another cell. Cell-cell recognition. How do your cells know that they're actually are next to each other, and how do they actually know to work together, like in your lungs? Intercellular joining, it's used to actually keep the cells together, like in your skin, so you don't leak out fluid, and we're not going to talk about that one. The cell membrane is known as a semipermeable membrane, meaning that the cell membrane can actually control what gets in and out of your cell. We don't want the cell membrane to allow everything in. We also don't want the cell membrane to not allow anything or anything out. So it's semi-permeable. It's actually going to select, or it's known as selectively permeable. It's going to choose what can enter, and it's going to choose what can actually leave. So what actually needs to get across the membrane? Well, we need sugar. We need lipids to actually make more lipids and to used in hormone production. We need AA, which are amino acids, which we should know are the building blocks of one macromolecule, which I'm going to ask you next time in class. We need oxygen to get in. We need water to get in. We need salts to get in to allow certain chemical reactions to occur. And we also need to allow waste to get out of our cells. So the cell membrane is a highly organized structure. It's going to control what goes in. It's going to control what goes out. The next time we're going to discuss specifically what are the different ways that things can actually get into your cell and out of your cell, and what are the different terms for cellular transport, how things are actually moving from your cell, into your cell, and out of your cell.